I came back to my ranch after a year, and the HOA had built an entire neighborhood right on my pasture. The woman in charge, Marla, looked me dead in the eye and told me my own family home was scheduled for demolition. They built their perfect little houses right on the land where my wife's ashes are buried. But while she was handing me violation notices, she had no idea her entire neighborhood was built on a single, massive lie. And that lie is why now they're all paying me rent. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments because you're gonna want to see this. And if you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied out of their own home by a corrupt HOA, hit subscribe because you won't want to miss the moment they pay the price. The truck's tires crunched on gravel, the last mile of county road before my turnoff. For the first time in a year, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. A whole year away in another state, sitting in hospital rooms, helping my son Michael learn to walk again after that fall from the scaffolding. He was finally on his own 2 feet, steady and smiling. Now, it was my turn to come home, to the quiet, to the smell of pine and dust on my own 40 acres. I pictured my driveway, 2 dirt ruts worn into the earth, just wide enough for the old Ford. I pictured the north pasture, probably overgrown with wildflowers, where my Anna used to set up her easel to paint the sunsets. The place was more her than me, even now. Coming back felt like coming back to the last piece of her I had left. But when I made the turn, my foot hit the brake so hard the truck shuddered. The dirt road was gone. In its place was smooth, black pavement, still smelling faintly of tar under the afternoon sun. And blocking the entrance was a gate. Not my old wire gate I'd have to get out and unhitch, but a new thing, made of painted aluminum bars. Beside it, a professionally printed sign was planted in a bed of fresh mulch. It read, "Welcome to Oak Loop Estates, HOA members only." My heart hammered against my ribs. I got out of the truck, the door groaning in protest, and just stood there, staring. Oak Loop Estates? This was Brannan land. It had been Brannan land for 3 generations. Beyond the gate, where my north pasture should have been rolling toward the tree line, was a row of 20 identical houses. They were packed in tight, with perfect green squares of lawn and sapling trees held up by stakes. Kids on bicycles zipped down the new street, their laughter echoing in the place where the only sound should have been the wind. A woman watering a sad-looking flower bed glanced up at me, then quickly looked away. It was like I'd driven into a different dimension, a neat, tidy, soulless dimension built right on top of my memories. That field wasn't just land. It was where Anna and I had our first picnic. It was where I'd taught Michael to fly a kite. Every inch of it was soaked in a life they'd just paved over. Then I saw her. A woman with a clipboard and a posture as stiff as a 2x4 marched down the street toward me. She had that brittle blonde haircut that looked like it would crack if you touched it, and her smile was as fake as the plastic shutters on the houses behind her. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She stopped a good 10 feet away, eyeing my dusty truck like it was a piece of garbage that had washed up on her pristine shore. "This is a private community for residents and their approved guests only." I felt a slow, cold burn start in my chest. I tried to keep my voice steady. "This is my property," I said, plain as I could. "I'm Jack Brannan. I own all 40 acres here." Her smile tightened. It didn't reach her eyes, which were scanning me from my worn work boots to my faded ball cap. "I think you must be confused," she said, her tone shifting from polite to condescending. "This is Oak Loop Estates. I'm Marla Keating, the HOA president." She said, HOA president, like she was announcing she was Queen of England. She took a step closer, tapping her pen on her clipboard. "Perhaps you're looking for the old access road on the other side of the county line?" I shook my head, my patience fraying. This was beyond a simple mistake. I walked back to my truck, pulled the weathered leather folio from the glove box, and took out the deed. The paper was thick, the edges soft from years of handling. My grandfather's name was on it, then my father's, then mine. I held it out to her. "This says I own the entire parcel, from the county road to the creek. There's no Oak Loop Estates on here." She barely glanced at it, waving her hand dismissively, as if I'd tried to show her a child's drawing. "Any discrepancies will need to be appealed through the HOA Legal Review Board," she chirped, a line that sounded rehearsed. "You can submit a formal inquiry, and we'll review it at our next quarterly meeting." She was treating me like I was the one trespassing, Like my deed, my history meant nothing against her clipboard and her made-up authority. Anger, hot and pure, started to boil in my gut. While she was busy playing bureaucrat, a piece of paper fell from her clipboard and fluttered to the pavement. It was a violation notice, for me, for unauthorized entrance and non-resident vehicle parked in a restricted zone, my own driveway. Before I could say a word, she delivered the final blow. She looked past me, toward my old ranch house, barely visible through the trees. It was the house I'd built with my own hands, the house Anna had made a home. Marla gave a little dissatisfied sniff. "And speaking of that structure," she said, her voice turning cold as ice, "you should know that the main house is currently under review. It's been scheduled for a compliance inspection and possible demolition." Demolition. The word hit me like a physical punch. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All the strength drained out of me, leaving a hollow, roaring emptiness. This wasn't a mix-up. This was an invasion. They hadn't just built on my land. They were planning to erase me from it entirely. She saw the look on my face, and for a fleeting second, a genuine cruel smile flashed across her lips. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of polite authority. "You'll be receiving all the official notices by mail," she said brightly, turning on her heel. I just stood there, watching her walk away, my deed hanging uselessly from my hand. I felt numb. I finally got back in the truck, my hands shaking so much I could barely turn the key. But I didn't drive away. I put the truck in gear and rolled slowly, defiantly, past her gate. She shouted something after me, but the sound was swallowed by the rumble of the engine. I drove down the street that had been my driveway for 50 years, past houses full of strangers, until I saw my home. My small, sturdy house with the porch swing Anna loved. It looked tired, a little neglected after a year, but it was still standing. It was still mine. I walked up the familiar wooden steps, my boots echoing in the sudden silence, and there, stapled right into the heart of my front door, was a bright yellow piece of paper. The corners flapped in the breeze. In stark black letters, it read, "Notice of encroachment, non-compliant structure." They had put a condemnation notice on my home, on Anna's home, and that's when the numbness gave way to a cold, hard certainty. This was not over, not by a long shot. I ripped the yellow notice off my door, the staple leaving a jagged tear in the wood. Inside, the house was cold and musty, smelling of a year of stillness. I dropped my keys on the counter, the clatter unnaturally loud in the silence. For an hour I just walked from room to room, touching the furniture, running my hand along the walls I'd framed myself. Every part of it was a memory. The scuff mark on the floor where Michael fell off his tricycle. The windowsill Anna always filled with jars of wildflowers. Now, a woman with a clipboard was telling me it was a non-compliant structure. It felt like a dream, a sick joke. But the paper in my hand was real. The next morning, I was at the county clerk's office when they opened. The place smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I went to the records counter and handed my original deed to a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, the new road, the houses, the HOA. He typed my parcel number into his computer with one finger, chewing on the end of a pen. He frowned, clicked a few more times, and then swiveled the monitor toward me. "Right here, sir," he said, pointing. "Boundary adjustment filed 13 months ago. Your 40-acre parcel was subdivided. 20 acres were sold to a developer, Oak Loop LLC. My blood ran cold. Sold? I didn't sell anything. I was out of state. He just shrugged, a classic bureaucratic gesture that said, "Not my problem. All the paperwork is in order. Signatures, notary stamps. It all looked legitimate to us." He turned the monitor back around, ready to move on to the next person in line. I felt a surge of helpless anger. This couldn't be it. I couldn't lose half my life because a kid in a cheap tie said a piece of paper looked legitimate. As I stood there, frozen, an older woman working at a desk behind the counter caught my eye. She had kind, tired eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd been watching the whole exchange. When the young clerk got up to go to the printer, she leaned forward just a little and spoke in a voice so low it was barely a whisper. "Asked to see the original plat map filing," she murmured, not looking directly at me. "Something about those documents? They looked off. Pushed through too fast." Then she sat back, suddenly very busy with a stack of files. Her nameplate read, Susan Hale. That little spark was all I needed. I asked the clerk for the original plat, and after a good 20 minutes of grumbling, he returned with a large, rolled-up document. He spread it out on the counter, and there it was. My land, carved up with neat, precise lines. Little squares with lot numbers on them, and right in the middle of it, a new cul-de-sac called Anna's Grove. The name was a calculated cruelty, a slap in the face. But the real horror hit me when I traced the new boundary line. It ran straight through the north pasture, just past the small rise where the big oak tree stands. The oldest tree on the property. The tree Anna had loved more than any other. The tree where her ashes were buried. A wave of nausea washed over me. Some stranger's backyard was on top of my wife's final resting place. Their kids were probably running around on it. Their dog was probably digging in it. The thought was so violating, so profoundly wrong, that I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep myself steady. This wasn't just about land anymore. They had desecrated something sacred. I drove home in a daze. The fraudulent map burned into my mind. They'd done it while I was gone. While I was sitting by my son's hospital bed, worrying about his future, someone was back here, methodically stealing my past. It was a planned attack. They knew I was away. They'd used my family crisis as their window of opportunity. The next afternoon, the mail carrier left a thick, crisp envelope in my box. It had the Oak Loop Estates HOA logo on it. Inside, there was no friendly welcome. It was a bill for $1,400 to $800. It was itemized. 12 months of back due membership fees, new resident capital contribution, road maintenance assessment, and a list of other ridiculous charges. At the bottom, in bold red letters, was a warning: failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in a lien being placed on your property. They were charging me fees to live in my own house, on land they'd stolen from me, and were threatening to take the rest of it if I didn't pay up. That evening, I sat on the porch swing, the one I'd built for Anna on our first anniversary. It creaked with a familiar rhythm. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. From here, I could just see the roofline of one of the new houses, peeking through the trees. I looked out toward the north pasture, toward the old oak, my land, my wife's oak tree, my whole life. Marla Keating and her developers thought they had won. They thought the old man in the dusty truck would just roll over, get buried in their fake paperwork, and give up. They thought they could scare me off with threats of demolition and liens. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness. They had mistaken my grief for surrender. I sat there for a long time, watching the stars come out, the anger in my chest slowly cooling, hardening into something else, something cold and solid and patient. This wasn't a mix-up. It was a land grab, a deliberate, calculated theft, and the people who did it were sleeping soundly just a few hundred yards away, on my property. I took a deep, slow breath, the night air sharp in my lungs. I whispered it out into the dark, a promise to myself, to Anna, to the land itself. This isn't over. Marla Keating's war wasn't fought with bulldozers, but with paper. The fines started arriving a week after the first notice. They came in the same crisp, official envelopes, delivered like clockwork every Tuesday and Friday. The first one was for the shed, unapproved outbuilding, weathered and structurally unsound. That shed had been standing for 40 years. I'd built it with my father. It had survived 3 hurricanes and a microburst that took down a neighbor's barn. It was sounder than any of the particle board palaces Marla was presiding over. The fine was $500. A few days later, another one came. Exterior facade violation, non-conforming color palette. They were talking about my porch. It was painted a soft blue, the color Anna had picked out from a hardware store swatched 20 years ago. She said it matched the sky just before dusk. Apparently, it didn't match the HOA's approved shades of beige, grayish, or taupe. Another $500. Then came the notice about my chickens. 4 hens I kept for eggs. They were now non-compliant livestock in a residential zone. The most ridiculous was the letter declaring my old Ford F-150, the truck I'd driven for 15 years, was a commercial-grade vehicle and was therefore prohibited from being parked on community roads, which is what she called my driveway. They were fining me for parking my truck at my own house. The new homeowners were caught in the middle. I'd see them getting their mail or pulling their trash cans to the curb. Most would just stare at the ground, pretending not to see me. They were scared. Marla had clearly painted me as the enemy. I heard a couple of them talking one afternoon while I was fixing a loose board on my porch. They didn't see me sitting there. They called me the squatter. Said Marla told them I was a crazy old man trying to cause trouble and lower their property values. But not everyone bought it. One evening, a man about my son's age, Evan Shaw, was walking his dog. He slowed down as he passed my property line, and, when he was sure no one was watching, he gave me a quick, apologetic nod. "I'm sorry about all this, Mr. Brannon," he said, his voice low. "My wife and we had no idea. We just bought the house." I just nodded back. It wasn't his fault. He was a victim here too, just a different kind. The real battle wasn't with them. It was with Marla and her clipboard. Her primary soldier was a man named Tommy Griggs, the so-called compliance officer. He was a squirrely guy with a cheap polo shirt, bearing the HOA logo stretched tight over his gut. He carried himself like a sheriff's deputy, but he had the nervous eyes of a chihuahua. I found him one morning on my property, well past the new, imaginary boundary line they'd drawn. He was standing by my shed, snapping pictures with his phone. He didn't hear me walk up behind him. "That's far enough, son," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He jumped like he'd been shot, fumbling his phone. He puffed out his chest, trying to look official. "I'm conducting a compliance inspection, sir. This structure has been flagged for multiple violations." "You're trespassing," I said, not raising my voice. "This is my private property. The part you're standing on was never for sale and was never subdivided. I want you to delete those pictures and get off my land. Now." He started to bluster, spouting some nonsense about HOA covenants and community easements. I just stood there, arms crossed, and waited. I wasn't a big man, but I'd learned in the Army that you don't have to shout to be heard. His tough guy act melted under my stare. His face got pale, and he started backing away. "You're obstructing an official HOA investigation," he stammered. "This will be in my report." He practically ran back to the new pavement. It felt good for about 5 minutes. The next day there was another envelope. This one wasn't a fine. It was a formal warning for threatening and intimidating behavior toward an HOA official. Marla had twisted my quiet stand into an act of aggression. That was the moment I knew. I couldn't fight them with their own rules. They could invent new ones faster than I could read them. Trying to reason with them was like trying to reason with a flood. I had to go deeper. I had to find the foundation of their whole flimsy empire and kick it out from under them. So I started digging. Not with a shovel, but with paper. I pulled out my old footlocker from the attic, the one with all my Army engineering manuals. I spent nights at the kitchen table, surrounded by my original property deeds, old county surveyor maps I'd requested, and copies of the development plans I'd managed to get from the clerk's office. I worked with a magnifying glass and a surveyor's scale, cross-referencing every line, every number. My training was in building things, in knowing how a structure stands or falls. I looked at their subdivision the same way. What was holding it up? For weeks it was nothing. Their forged boundary adjustment was clean on the surface. But they had been arrogant. They had been in a hurry. Late one night, fueled by black coffee, I found it. It wasn't on the new maps. It was a footnote in my grandfather's original deed from 1952. A single, beautiful sentence that developers always hate to see. All mineral, access, and easement rights are retained by the grantor and their heirs in perpetuity, and are not extinguished by any subsequent survey or subdivision. In simple terms, they had built 20 houses on land they didn't fully own. They owned the dirt on top, but I still owned the right to everything underneath it, and more importantly, the legal right to access it. They had built an entire neighborhood on my unextinguished rights. A slow smile spread across my face for the first time in what felt like a year. They thought they had me trapped with their rules and their fines. They had no idea they were the ones in the cage. I was still working on how to best use the mineral rights bombshell when Marla launched her next attack. It was more personal, more dangerous. A notice appeared on my door, this one from the County Water Authority. It claimed an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding an unregistered, potentially contaminated well on my property. My well wasn't unregistered. It was grandfathered in decades before the county even had a water department. But that didn't matter. The notice said an inspector would be out in 48 hours, and if they found any issues, they had the authority to cap the well and shut off my water immediately. Without water, my house would be legally uninhabitable. She was trying to condemn my home through a back door. This was no longer just about fines or fences. This was an attempt to drive me out for good. The pressure was getting to be too much. The constant barrage of letters, the hostile glares from strangers living on my land, the sick feeling in my stomach every time I saw Marla's car cruise by my house. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, and I was bleeding out. That night, my son Michael called. His voice was full of worry. "Dad, I heard from Uncle Joe what's going on down there. Are you okay?" I tried to downplay it, tell him I had it under control, but he could hear the exhaustion in my voice. He'd always been able to read me, even over the phone. "Dad, just let it go," he said, his voice pleading. "It's not worth it. It's just land. You can come live with me and Sarah. We have the spare room all set up for you. Please, just sell what's left of the place and get out of there. It's not worth losing the house over this." The words hit me harder than any of Marla's notices. I knew he was saying it out of love, out of a desire to protect me, but it felt like a surrender. "It's just land." He didn't understand. It wasn't just land. It was the last physical piece of his mother. It was our history. But how could I explain that to him without sounding like a crazy old man clinging to ghosts? Hearing the defeat in my own son's voice, the man whose strength and recovery had kept me going for a year, nearly broke me. For the first time, I felt the crushing weight of hopelessness. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just being a stubborn old fool. I tried one last time to fight them on their terms. I spent 2 days compiling all my documents, the original deed, the notice of encroachment, copies of the fines, the water threat, and I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board as their own bylaws required. I sent it by certified mail. I got a response a week later, not from Marla, but from a law firm in the city. It was a 10-page letter filled with so much legal jargon it made my head spin. It was a masterpiece of intimidation, a dense forest of threats and dismissals designed to make someone like me give up. They said my complaint was frivolous and without merit, that my deed was superseded by the new subdivision plat, and that my continued resistance would result in further legal action, for which I would be financially responsible. It was a checkmate. They had buried me in paper, just like they planned. That afternoon was my lowest point. The world felt gray and faded. I walked the fence line, the one I had built with my own hands 30 years ago, which now separated my yard from a stranger's perfectly manicured lawn. On the other side, a little girl with bright red pigtails was riding a tricycle on her patio, a patio built on land where I used to stack hay bales. She looked up, saw me watching, and gave me a shy, hesitant wave. I couldn't even manage to wave back. I just felt broken, empty. Michael was right. Marla had won. I turned to walk back to the house, ready to call my son and tell him I was done. As I turned, my boot kicked a loose rock near one of the old fence posts. It wasn't just a rock, it was half buried in the dirt, and it had a strange orange cap on it. I knelt down, my knees cracking in protest, and brushed the soil away. My breath caught in my throat. It was an iron pin, a survey marker, but it was in the wrong place. I knew this fence line like the back of my hand. The corner pin was supposed to be another 20-30 feet from here, closer to the big sycamore tree. I had helped my father dig the hole for that marker when I was a boy. I stood up and looked from the pin to the sycamore, then back to the pin. It wasn't just off by a few inches, the kind of error that happens over time. This marker was off by a country mile. The fence I was standing next to, the one Marla's new development used as its official boundary, was built on a lie. This survey pin, this small, forgotten piece of iron in the dirt, it couldn't have gotten there by accident. A measurement error this big. This had to be intentional, and in that moment, the fog of despair began to lift, replaced by the clear, cold light of a new idea. This wasn't just a flaw in their paperwork. This was proof. Hard, physical, ironclad proof. That night, I made a phone call I should have made weeks ago. Ray Delgado and I had served together in the Army Corps of Engineers for 15 years. He was a surveyor, a man who trusted numbers and iron pins more than he trusted people. He retired a few years back and was living 2 states over, bored out of his mind, mostly tinkering with old radios. When I told him what was going on, he just said, I'll be there Thursday. He pulled up in his old camper van, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a case full of equipment in the other. Ray wasn't a man for small talk. He just nodded at me, took a look around and said, "All right, Jack, show me the mess." I walked him to the back fence, to the marker I'd found. He knelt down, just like I had, and ran his fingers over the iron cap. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he pulled out a GPS unit that looked like it could survive a direct hit from a mortar, and he started taking readings. For the next 3 hours, we walked. We walked the entire perimeter of what the HOA was calling Oak Loop Estates. He'd stop every 100 yards or so, set up his tripod, and take measurements. He was silent, focused, a man completely in his element. Finally, we ended up back where we started, by the misplaced pin. He took a long sip from his thermos, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at me. His face was grim. "It's worse than you thought," he said. I felt my stomach clench. "How bad?" Ray pointed with his thermos, first toward the row of new houses, then back toward my property. "Their map, the one they filed with the county, it's based on that pin right there. But the real original corner pin, the one your daddy and I drank a beer over 30 years ago, it's over there." He pointed a good 37 feet deeper into the new subdivision. He let that sink in for a moment. I checked it against the old county records and the geodetic survey benchmarks. There's no mistake. This pin, he kicked the marker with his boot, is fraudulent. Somebody planted it here. He looked me straight in the eye, and his voice was low and steady. He knew I needed it in plain language. "Jack, they didn't just build on your subdivided pasture. They built half this neighborhood on the 20 acres you were supposed to have left. That little girl's patio, that's about 15 feet inside your actual property line. Every single house on this side of the street is encroaching on your land." He had confirmed it. My gut feeling, the buried pin, the suffocating injustice. It was all real, and now it had a number, 37 feet. The next 2 days were a blur of focused action. With Ray's certified survey in hand, I didn't waste my time with the HOA or their lawyers. I went to a different kind of lawyer, a quiet old man downtown who specialized in real estate and title disputes. I didn't want to fight, I wanted a lockdown. We didn't file a lawsuit. We filed something much faster, much more powerful. First, a quiet title action, a legal move that basically asks a judge to clear up who owns what, officially challenging the fraudulent subdivision map. Second, and this was the masterstroke, we recorded a land lease demand. It was a simple, legal document. It stated that as the rightful owner of the land currently occupied by structures belonging to other parties, those parties were now considered tenants on my property. Effective immediately, every home sitting on my land owed me a mandatory monthly rent until the boundary dispute was resolved in court. We didn't send it to the HOA. We sent it directly to the 13 homeowners whose houses were now, legally, on my property. The shockwave hit 48 hours later. It started with a tentative knock on my door. It was Evan Shaw, the young father who had apologized to me weeks ago. He was holding my letter, his face pale with worry. "Mr. Brannon, is this for real?" he asked. I invited him in, and for the first time, one of the new residents crossed my threshold. I laid out Ray's survey on my kitchen table, next to the HOA's fraudulent plat map. I didn't use any fancy words. I just pointed. "This is the line they told you was the boundary, and this," I traced the true line with my finger, "is where it actually is. Your house is on my land. I'm sorry you were lied to, but the lie wasn't mine." Within the hour, 3 more of his neighbors were on my porch, all holding the same letter, all with the same scared, angry look in their eyes. The rumors Marla had spread about me being a crazy squatter evaporated in the face of Ray's hard numbers. I was no longer the villain. I was the man they'd all been lied to about. It didn't take long for the news to reach the Queen. Marla's car screeched to a halt in front of my house. She stormed up my walkway, 2 other board members trailing behind her like nervous little birds. She didn't even knock. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, waving one of the rent notices in my face. "You are not allowed to contact homeowners directly. This is harassment. This is blackmail." I didn't raise my voice. I just held up Ray's certified survey, the official seal from the State Surveyor's Board gleaming under the porch light. "This is a legal survey of my property, Marla," I said calmly. "And this is a legal land lease demand for the tenants currently residing on it. You built your neighborhood on my land. That makes them my tenants until a judge says otherwise. I watched the color drain from her face. The smug confidence she always wore shattered, replaced by a flicker of pure panic. Her brittle authority was built on a foundation of lies and paperwork, and I had just shown her the one piece of paper that could bring it all crashing down. She sputtered, trying to find her footing, trying to regain control. This is illegal. We will have an emergency meeting, she declared, her voice cracking. Public, mandatory attendance. We will sort this out. Good, I thought. That's exactly what I want. The community clubhouse, a sterile beige building that smelled of new carpet and paint, was packed. People were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Every homeowner was there, their faces a mix of confusion, anger, and fear. My rent notices had done their job. The threat of having to pay a mortgage and a surprise rent payment had gotten everyone's attention. I saw dozens of phones held up, their little red recording lights glowing in the dim room. Ray sat next to me in the front row, calm as a stone, a leather portfolio resting on his lap. Marla Keating stood at a flimsy podium at the front, flanked by Tommy Griggs and the board treasurer, Linda Rourke, who was nervously shuffling a stack of papers. Marla tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the room. She tried for her usual tone of brisk, cheerful authority, but her voice was tight. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her smile stretched thin. "It has come to our attention that a disgruntled individual has been circulating some frankly baseless and intimidating documents to our residents. I want to assure you all that the HOA's legal team is handling this aggressive tactic," and that was as far as she got. Before she could launch into her web of lies, I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't rush the stage. I just stood there, waiting, until every eye in the room was on me. The room fell silent. "My name is Jack Brannon," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily to the back wall. "The disgruntled individual she's talking about is me, and the land this clubhouse is built on, and the land many of your homes are built on, belongs to my family." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marla's face hardened. "Mr. Brannon, you are out of order. This is an official board meeting." I ignored her. I walked to the front of the room and looked out at the faces of my new, accidental neighbors. "You all have a right to know the truth," I said. "You've been lied to since the day you signed your purchase agreements." I nodded to Ray. He stood up and carried a large, rolled-up map to the front, tacking it to the wall behind Marla. It was his certified survey, the lines crisp and clear. Then he tacked the HOA's own plat map right next to it. Even from the back of the room, the difference was obvious. The red line marking my true property boundary on Ray's map cut a deep slice through the neat little boxes on the HOA's map. I didn't need a microphone. I just spoke, plain and simple, like I was explaining how to frame a wall. 3 simple steps. This is how I proved it. I pointed to a spot on Ray's map. First, we found the original century-old survey markers, the real ones. The ones the developers either didn't find or pretended not to. They're made of iron, buried deep, and they do not lie. Next, I pointed to a list of coordinates on the side of the survey. Second, we matched those pins to the official GPS coordinates held by the county and the state. It's a perfect match. The county's records confirm my boundaries have not changed in 70 years. Finally, I pointed at the fraudulent pin's location. And third, the county clerk's own records show that the survey map this entire development was based on was edited and refiled after the initial building permits were approved. Somebody moved the line on paper after the fact to grab more land. The room erupted. It wasn't just murmuring anymore. It was shouting. People were on their feet, yelling questions at the stage. A man in the front row, Evan Shaw, stood up and turned to face Marla, his voice shaking with fury. "We've been paying you. We paid HOA fees. We paid special assessments for landscaping and road maintenance. On land you don't even own? Was that our money or his?" Marla's face was ghost white. She was visibly sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The mask of control was gone. All that was left was a scared, cornered woman. She started fumbling, blaming volunteers, blaming the developer, blaming the county clerks for not catching the error. The crowd wasn't buying it. They started booing, a low rumble that grew into a roar of outrage. Her authority, built on paper and fear, had vanished in the span of 5 minutes. Linda Rourke, the treasurer, looked like she was about to be sick. Tommy Griggs was trying to shrink into the wall behind the podium. Then, a man in the back stood up. He was older, with a quiet, serious demeanor. He held up a thick stack of papers. It was his property deed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "My deed, the one your title company gave me, references Mr. Brannon's mineral rights as an easement. I didn't think much of it at the time." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Does that mean I've been paying property taxes and HOA dues to you for a piece of land that legally isn't even entirely mine?" Marla just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She had no answer. The question was a bomb, and it had just detonated in the middle of her tidy, perfect world. The room flipped. It was no longer her against me. It was now everyone against her. That meeting broke Marla's power, but it didn't break her pride. For the next 2 weeks, she spiraled. Her campaign of paper cuts turned into a frenzy of desperate, sloppy attacks. She started spreading rumors that I had bribed the surveyor, that Ray's credentials were fake, that I had forged the documents myself. She even tried to file a restraining order against me, claiming I was a threat to the community. A local deputy, a calm, tired-looking man named Mark Jensen, came out to my house to serve the papers. He didn't look happy about it. I invited him in for a cup of coffee and laid out my survey maps on the table. He listened patiently for 20 minutes, nodding, his eyes sharp. When I was done, he folded the unserved papers and tucked them into his shirt pocket. "We get a lot of calls from this subdivision, Mr. Brannon," he said, shaking his head. "I've got a feeling we won't be bothering you with this again." He was right. The order was thrown out, but Marla was not done. She knew that the iron pins Ray had located were the physical evidence that proved her fraud. If they disappeared, it would become her word against mine. I figured she might try something that stupid. The night after the deputy's visit, I took a small trail camera I used for watching deer and strapped it high up on the sycamore tree. The lens aimed directly at the true corner pin, the one buried near my back fence. I didn't have to wait long. Just after 2 a.m, my dog started a low growl. I went to the window and saw a flicker of movement near the back of my property. It was her. Marla Keating, dressed in dark clothes, was hunched over the survey marker with a shovel and a crowbar, trying to dig it out of the ground. She was grunting with effort, frantically hacking at the dirt. So consumed by her task, she didn't see the little red light blinking on the camera just a few feet above her head. She was trying to destroy the evidence. I didn't yell. I didn't go out there. I just picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office. I told them someone was trespassing and attempting to damage property markers. I made sure to mention that a report had been filed about this specific boundary just last week. Deputy Jensen was on shift. The arrival of his cruiser was quiet, no sirens, just the headlights cutting through the darkness. Marla was so focused she didn't notice until the spotlight hit her, freezing her like a panicked animal. Shovel in one hand, crowbar in the other, covered in mud. It was perfect. She was arrested for trespassing, vandalism of a survey monument, a felony in our state, and attempted tampering with evidence. The sight of her in handcuffs, her face a mask of shock and humiliation, was the final nail in the coffin of Oak Loop Estates HOA. The fallout was swift. With Marla facing criminal charges, the homeowners, led by Evan Shaw, hired a lawyer and filed a massive lawsuit against not just the HOA, but the developers who had hired the fraudulent surveyor in the first place. Faced with mounting legal fees and public disgrace, the entire HOA board resigned. The developers' lawyers called my lawyer. They wanted to make a deal, and they wanted to do it quickly and quietly. We sat down in a conference room that cost more per hour than my truck was worth. It didn't matter. I held all the cards. The settlement was simple, and it was on my terms. First, my original 40-acre property lines were to be immediately and officially restored on all county and state records. The fraudulent subdivision was void. Second, for the 13 homes that were undeniably built on my land, the homeowners would sign a formal land lease agreement. I didn't want to punish them, so I set the rent at $1 a year for 99 years. It wasn't about money, it was about the principle. They now had a legal document proving they lived on my land, protecting them from any future HOA and giving me final say. Third, the developer would pay a substantial sum to a community trust, managed by the homeowners themselves, to repay every dollar of illegal fees the HOA had ever collected from them. And finally, they would pay for the removal of the new road, the gate, and all the ridiculous signage, and for the restoration of my north pasture. Over the next few months, things started to change. The gate came down. The fancy Oak Loop Estates sign was hauled away. The new homeowners, no longer afraid of a clipboard bully, started acting like neighbors. Evan Shaw and a few other men helped me tear down the fence that had separated us. We shared beers and stories while we worked. Their kids started coming over to pet my dog and ask questions about the chickens. They were good people who had just been caught in a bad situation. One Saturday, a small group of them showed up at my door with shovels and bags of wildflower seeds. They wanted to help me start replanting the pasture. As we worked under the sun, digging and scattering seeds, I saw a couple of the kids run over to the big oak tree. Later that afternoon, when everyone had gone home and the quiet had settled back over the land, I walked over to the tree. Leaning against its ancient trunk was a small new sign, beautifully carved from a piece of oak. It read, "Brannan Ridge, in memory of Anna." One of the neighbors had made it. I ran my hand over the smooth letters, a lump forming in my throat. My land was whole again. My wife's memory was safe. Justice wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about restoring what was broken. And standing there, under the branches of her favorite tree, surrounded by a community that had found its way back to being neighbors, I finally felt like I was home.